It's great to be here, so thank you for coming. So yeah, I just want to start out by saying conservation has traditionally been a little bit slow to adopt technology, but I feel like the sector is making up for lost time now. We hear about applications of blockchain, AI, drones, analyzing satellite data, so it's actually pretty exciting. The Mongabay folks are actually in town right now for a tech summit held by Microsoft, and they're convening all sorts of people who are working on different aspects of technology and how conservation can leverage that. So again, a lot of exciting stuff happening, and I'm thrilled to have our panelists here who are working in different aspects of this space. So again, I think it's an exciting panel. So yeah, to start out, I wanted to go to Megan first and hear about what you're working on and what problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start by saying that studying seabirds is really kind of studying an animal that is very remote. Most seabirds spend their entire lives on the open ocean, and this is particularly true for the species that I specialize in. My specialty is in tube-nosed seabirds, so these are animals like petrels, shearwaters, storm petrels, and many of these birds will be at sea until they're 7 years old. They'll come back to land. So you can imagine that the field of researching seabirds is challenging. It's hard to access colonies. It's hard to identify where they're nesting. Many of these seabirds are nocturnal. Many of them nest underground in burrows. So they're a really fascinating creature because of their life at sea, but they're also really challenging to study. And so my research has been looking at how we can use their sort of unique sensory world that they have for this, achieving life on the open ocean and nesting on land in these islands for their conservation. So, for example, a couple of the projects that I work on are for example, the New Zealand storm petrel, which is a species of seabird that was thought to be extinct for over 100 years. And this species was rediscovered using technology. Its breeding sites were discovered using tracking devices. And my involvement in the project is using acoustics and bioacoustics particularly to identify where they're breeding on these huge islands, and also to use those acoustics to attract them to nesting sites. And we're also, this is a very critically endangered bird, but there's also other seabirds like the buller shearwater, another species that I work on, that have never been studied before. So we're able to use how they call at night to identify the breadth of their breeding habitat, and things like automated kind of motion detector, camera trapping devices to get a better idea of their behavior, their breeding biology, how often they're visiting chicks, how often they're feeding their, incubating their eggs. And these are all things that haven't been possible in the past. We would have had to have a person at those sites all the time to identify those things. So the use of technology in seabird research is really changing the way we're able to study seabirds. Yeah.
Great, thanks for that. So now going from remote ocean islands to deep in the Amazon, Chris, you have a very different audience you're working with, or users you're working with. So can you tell us what you're doing?
I work with Akate Amazon Conservation, and it's an on-the-ground conservation organization incorporated in both the United States and Peru. We partner with the Matsas indigenous people. The Matsas are an indigenous group relatively recently contacted that live on the frontier edge of the border of northeast Peru and Brazil. About 2/3 live on the Peruvian side, 1/3 live in Brazil. We work with the Matsas to help them, to support them as they adapt to the outside world, to maintain their self-sufficiency, their independence, their culture, and to protect their way of life and their ancestral lands. Technology is a major underpinning of many of our initiatives with the Matsas people. One of our early initiatives was to work with them to maintain their traditional medicine. The Matsas had seen what happened with other indigenous groups, where in short years and in a generation after contact, their entire rainforest knowledge of rainforest medicinal plants was not being passed down. It really was kept in just a few in the minds of just a handful of remaining elders. As the concrete first step, the Matses paired the remaining elder shamans with younger Matses, and using digital cameras, laptops, they recorded their entire medicinal plant knowledge, and an unprecedented project resulted in a 1,000-page encyclopedia written in their own language, in their own words, the first of its kind. I can't emphasize that the entire project was developed and led by the Matses themselves. The only thing that happened outside the Matses territories was the actual printing of the encyclopedia within it. Another project that the Matses are almost halfway through is using GPS technology to map for the first time their ancestral lands. If you look at the few maps that exist of this territory that were created by government or by petroleum extraction industries, they're just blank areas with the small dots representing their current settlements. Only the major rivers are named in Spanish. But that's not their territory. Their ancestral territories in Peru comprise over 3 million acres. So over the past 3 years, the Matses have gone throughout the territory with GPS units and have mapped their ancestral headwaters, their ancestral village sites, areas of sacred sites of significance, and they're putting this together. Now, this participatory indigenous mapping has been done with indigenous groups throughout the world. One aspect that ours is different is we're working to capacitate the Matses to develop the maps themselves. And that involves teaching them not just how to use, to train them not just how to use a GPS unit, but how to use the complex mapping software, which is considering that most of them had not even opened up a laptop or plugged in a laptop before, and from that they've learned how to do basic computing, word processing, gain a capacitation of a vital skill set that helps them in terms of their interactions with the outside world, with local and national governments to protect against the ever-present threats from timber companies, from the government in terms of in regards to encroachment. Other aspects of what technology is with biodiversity assessment. And when people talk about conservation in these remote areas, it's usually what not to do. Don't do timber, don't participate in petroleum, don't get involved in gold mines. But in these remote areas, where are the economic alternatives? Even the Matses, which are relatively recently contacted tribe, are drawn into the cash economy to have and require money to buy basic medication and household goods within that. So one of our projects involved training them to do inventory of reptiles and amphibians in their territories. And this is a very remote area. To give you a sense on the Brazilian side of the Matses territory, there's more uncontacted tribal groups of voluntary isolation in any part of Romania of the world. It's an incredibly isolated group. There have been biologic inventories done, but these have been what are called rapid biologic inventories, with these big production where scientists go down for 3 to 4 weeks, often in the dry season when you don't really even see that many frogs. Whereas the indigenous people, they live there all the time. They have an incredible knowledge and mastery of the understanding of the rainforest environment and its animals. So by equipping them with iPhones, used old iPhones, which have a remarkable ability to take really good quality photography in the challenging light environments of the rainforest, stores thousands of images, videos. Then they bring that back, and then the images get reviewed with a herpetologist. And in the first pilot of it, which was just a week or two at night, in just one of their village, they described 3 new species. And so we're trying to, by capacitating to that, provide economic opportunities for future scientific and conservation efforts that can involve the younger generation.
Thanks, Chris. So Sue, you're editor of Wildtech, so you have a nice kind of overview of some of the trends that are happening in this space. So what are some things that you're really excited about in terms of trends and new technologies, and not just going beyond the hype as well?
Going beyond the hype. Okay, there's a lot of hype. There's a lot of hype in technology. The trends, I think what gets me every time as editor of Wildtech section of Mongabay.com, I see a lot of different technologies. I'm researching a lot of different technologies, and I think what gets me is the number of them. First of all, the number of things that are being done, and people using things in new creative ways is just sort of an overall technology trend, I think. As you were saying, it's exploding, and there's more people using them. Technology becoming, I think, cheaper. So basically what I was going to say actually before, through all these things that I see, the changes that I've seen are technologies that were not available 5 or 10 years ago, and things like drones and iPhone apps or smartphone apps, I should say, that weren't available that long ago that are now quite commonly used by an increasingly broader audience. And then also things that are becoming cheaper and more accessible, things like satellite images that used to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars are now either freely available to anyone, basically, who registers, or quite low cost. Or things that like cryptic cameras or camera traps that were developed for hunting and now are used for a range of different activities by people. And they're also becoming much more affordable, that people can use them in more different situations. So those are 2 things I would say would be good trends that way. In terms of specific technologies, it really depends on people's questions. I think we've just come from this conference on artificial intelligence. I think that's something that's going to be coming. It's still emerging and new, but it's being used in increasingly broader circumstances. I think that's going to be a really big technology for people to use, so it seems, from what we've learned.
Yeah.
There's plenty of things. There's plenty more to come. There are many technologies. Some of the basics I think that still limit technology are things like batteries or things like weight, if something's going to fly, that kind of thing. But as things go, batteries are getting better. Things are becoming smaller, like sort of Moore's law, the increasingly small size of chips and technologies are allowing people to carry an iPhone to the Amazon that they didn't used to be able to do, that can do increasingly more with an increasingly smaller chip. So just this shrinking and cheaper seems to be across the board in terms of
So one of the things that AI is being used for is scaling. So when you used to have someone manually looking at photos, now you can have machine learning scale that process. So curious to you the panel's thoughts on how scalable are the technologies that they're using now. So maybe you want to start with that.
Yeah, so I think that we're studying wildlife. Like I mentioned, these animals are really hard to access, and my experience with seabirds is that so many of these species are in conservation threats. They're of conservation concern. So the ability to scale up our research is really important, and we are using acoustics now, particularly as, like you were saying, a very cost-effective way to get research about what species are on islands that people just can't spend time at. It's way too expensive, way too difficult, and now we have the ability to actually find out where species are, how many of them they are, and potentially even more importantly, when they're missing. So when we can use kind of machine learning techniques to identify what species are present, and potentially even more importantly, what species are missing. And exactly, the cost effectiveness of these materials now is such that while they might cause startup issues, because these devices are not super cheap, especially for ecologists, once you own them, you have the ability to really gain a ton of data spread across a wide geographic range.
Chris, you want to speak about?
Absolutely. I think the potential for scalability is there. I mean, within the 3 examples that I spoke to you about. So, for example, with the mapping project, right? They got capacitated in the use of GPS units. Well, one of our core projects is with sustainable economic development, right? To provide economic alternatives to extractive industries where few or none exist. And so in order to legally export non-timber products from Peru, you need to have what's called a management plan. It's a formal plan that's developed with the forestry ministry. And in order what that plan involves demarcating out, for example, there's a tree that a resin is extracted from, demarcating out in different zones. They took that and then the skills they acquired with the mapping, and then they demarcated out 10,000 trees in their territory over a period. So it's really extraordinary within that. And also, this is a very remote area. There's no cell phone coverage in almost entirety there, but can you imagine a time where there will be, and that probably won't be that long from now, where the work that they can do? I think the most powerful the advocates for indigenous rights and for the rainforests of the indigenous peoples themselves. So to getting their voice directly out there real time is really going to be a powerful application of that.
Sue, do you have thoughts on scaling?
Yeah. I was going to say, one of the things I was going to talk about, a technology that I've used and been involved with is tracking of animals. I know it's sort of transformed how people have watched wildlife, and the scaling is things that are getting cheaper and things that are getting smaller. Again, sort of similar to what I just said before. But the fact that they're cheaper means that you can use, people can obviously put more collars or more tags on more animals. As they get smaller, you can put them on smaller and smaller species. You can find out where animals go and what they're doing, like what they're going for. Like if you overlay, for instance, the explosion in remote sensing and ability of people to afford satellite imagery means you can look at where your animals are going, compare that to your image, and see, oh look, they all seem to be using that habitat. That's actually, turns out, is very important for that species that you may not have known otherwise, because you couldn't follow individual animals, that kind of thing. So as things get cheaper, more people can use them in more circumstances, and as they get smaller, you can use them on more animals. So that's one way of scaling up and allowing it to be used by more people. And I'll say the thing, we have a colleague who's putting smaller and smaller tags on animals, but also trying to combine them with solar panels. And as solar panels are getting smaller and smaller, you can actually attach them to a tag, and the tag can run forever, basically, because you're not having to provide a battery. The solar panel provides the energy, and so suddenly you can put it in a much more remote area that you don't have to return to collect it and put a new battery out, that kind of thing. So generally technology like that would allow people to do a lot more studying of animals, where they go, and what that is important for, I think, is what they need, and then where they're going with respect to where people are going as well.
So Chris, you kind of talked a bit about these economic opportunities that are resulting from technology, but so that's one way of getting local people involved. But are there other ways of engaging folks around use of technology? And I mean, this is for all the entire panel here.
Well, let me
Sure.
I would say with the traditional medicine project with Encyclopedia, before the project started in around 2012, there was not a single apprentice or younger Matses that was interested in learning the information. Why? Because they were taught that their culture and their interactions with the outside world was inferior. Every time they go to local frontier towns, they face racism and discrimination. They were taught that the old ways were to be forgotten, and that their future lies in the cities or towards that view of life. When they went in there and using their and participating in the project, it was a reawakening that this is their knowledge, that this is their medicine. And on one of our, I'm heading down just this weekend for our annual meeting with the chiefs from all 14 villages. And one of these meetings a couple of years ago, we were in one of these rainforest gardens where they cultivate hundreds of medicinal plant species. Because medicinal plant species don't grow in like what we would think about as a garden on the side of the house. They're jungle vines that can only grow inside the rainforest. And I was watching one of the younger Matses with a cell phone recording one of the elder Matses shamans is teaching. Of course, they have a phone. There's no coverage or anything like that. But it's really it's using it in the maps. The maps that they have. This is their land and their territory. They're putting it in every one of their village schools and everyone, and so it can have a real powerful effect.
Yes, I'm making the same question. So, I mean, can people engage and see the seabirds migrating across islands, things like that?
Yeah, and I think that, so one of the benefits of the research that I've done is on senses. So I always tell people that studying sensory ecology is amazing because we can really relate to how we perceive the world around us. And although seabirds perceive the world around them differently, a lot of them use smell more than we do to kind of locate prey and mates and whatnot. That it makes for relating to humans particularly valuable. And if you bear with me for a second, I can play for you what it sounds like to be on a seabird colony that's burgeoning with life at night. So this is, the Buller's shearwater colony. And I think that hearing these sounds and seeing the visualizations of birds caught by fisheries bycatch, the technology that's used to capture these images, to capture these sounds, is really thought-provoking and really is critical for conservation of wildlife.
Sue, I mean, with Wildtech, do you see much engagement on technology issues?
No, there's not. No. Again, I was trying to use just a single example or two because again, so many. I was just going to try to stick with a couple for this presentation. But going back to the tracking technology, and you might think, well, the people are doing research on animals, and what does that have to do with people? But in fact, it's really important in some cases because a lot of these animals are getting closer and closer to people. And in Africa, for instance, people are tracking elephants because they want to know where they go. They're in danger. They've been being poached for their ivory and that kind of thing. But one of the bigger problems that is much less known is the conflict that is constant and persistent across much of Africa and Asia of the conflict between farmers, basically, or ranchers and wildlife. So if you're tracking animals and seeing where they go, as relate to people, lions, for instance, or tigers will eat livestock, and elephants will trample and eat corn or other crops, many other crops. However, these are perhaps people that are in places that used to be traditional migratory routes, that kind of thing, for these animals, and so the animals come across them, or they either stumble upon them and eat them, that kind of thing, or they become accustomed to doing it. And so I think people will track problem animals, they call ones that persistently return to human areas, and they can warn people. That's a big part of technology, is warning people before animals actually get to their crops, so you can scare them before damage actually occurs, and that way it both saves the farmers and it also ends up saving the elephants or the tiger or lion, because there's not retaliation and killing them because they ruined your harvest for the year, which was devastating for many people. So in many of these villages, you might have raccoons, you might have deer eat your plants, eat your crops. They have really big, dangerous animals that come, and very few resources to deal with them. And so research that goes into tracking animals, and the better you can do it, the cheaper you can make it, the more animals can be tagged. Also in terms of where animals go over long periods of time, can help them from being poached, which helps a tourism economy, let's say, in a lot of places like that. So I'm thinking about Africa and Asia when I talk about this. In terms of, the other thing I was going to think of was sort of drones is a technology, obviously it was a military technology, but it's being used in many wildlife situations and also for photography, which helps people, obviously with the beauty of the photography, but also in terms of where things are with respect to other things. So an aerial view that gives you a viewpoint that is both sort of, it gives people perspective, I think, in terms of landscape. It helps a lot of projects that perhaps the satellite imagery is too broad and not a fine scale enough for people to see. People are using it for agriculture, let's say that's another big technology. Where do you put fertilizer? It turns out across your entire harvest area, maybe the soil is better in certain parts than others and doesn't need as much fertilizer, in which case you can save a lot of money by not putting fertilizer there, but only in the places that you need. And a lot of things you can tell this by the greenness of your vegetation that you can see from a sensor on a drone that flies over. That kind of thing. There's a lot of different ways people are using drones for agriculture and land use planning, that kind of thing.
So Sue mentioned batteries a few times. Chris mentioned lack of cell phone coverage, lack of bandwidth. So what are some of the major obstacles to tech adoption in places where you work? And I'll start with you.
Yeah, so again, with seabirds particularly, these animals are very remote. So you mentioned batteries. The batteries are one of the biggest obstacles, getting power to devices. I've taken special trips to islands just with backpacks full of batteries because you've got to change batteries, otherwise nothing works, obviously. So I think that is still an area of growth, and there's more new technology becoming available all the time with solar devices and but this is still one of the biggest issues. Another kind of obstacle that we have with wildlife biology is the amount of data that we collect, and that's always a good thing. You always want more data, but you have these huge amounts, and the ability to actually process the amount of data that we're collecting now with the new technology is an obstacle. We have to come up with better ways to kind of automate and kind of work on models to be able to do that data kind of mining for us. So these are the directions that a lot of these are going, is to now figure out what to do with all of this data that we're collecting. It's a good problem to have for the most part.
So Chris, besides lack of bandwidth, what are some of the challenges you face in your technology?
I think one of the challenges with on the ground conservation is funding. There's kind of here in the United States and other areas of the world, there's such an interest in conservation. There's funding allocated, but when going down to the actual on the ground in these remote areas of Amazon, what you see is lack of economic resources. So you have a lot of really extraordinary small organizations trying to make a difference on basically the most marginal budgets possible. With a mapping project we did, where their territory in Peru alone is 3 million acres. It's basically the size of Connecticut. They've mapped 2/3 of it with 2 GPS units, and they just it's slower. We don't have multiple teams out at once doing it, and just because the overall the budgets are limited and the costs are limited. But I think I think funding is one of the greatest limitations.
So let me just interject there. Do you ask for donations of equipment? Like, does Akate ask for full phones and GPS units and things? Is that like part of your strategy?
Yeah, I mean, what we do, we ask some of our friends and people that we know, but it's hard to ask for that in general without kind of a network of people things like that. But yeah, we've had friends that have given old cell phones and things like that to the initiatives and things like that. I mean, that's just those are one of the costs of it, not all the costs of it, but yeah, I think funding is always a challenge.
So Sue, sort of from your perch, like what do you see as the big obstacles to tech adoption in conservation?
Yeah, I think it's several, and I think like the battery life is one. And funding, and one of the things about funding I was going to say is that a lot of times getting equipment made for wildlife conservation or remote areas requires certain features that people that are living in an urban area might not think of. It's got to be low cost, typically. It's being used by, let's say, organizations that don't have a lot of funding, don't have a lot of money. It's got to be extremely rugged to deal with the salty atmosphere of a seabird colony, the humid and very heavy rainfall of a rainforest, the dense vegetation, the curious and very hungry animals that will come out and look at devices, a lack of spare parts or repairs, which you might not think of, but it's, you're in the Amazon, there's no place to get spare parts where he is, I'm going to guess. And just general remoteness, which also leads into the connectivity, people that are looking at devices that might communicate, a camera that can communicate a certain type of image with the headquarters of a park reserve. It only works if there's a way to transmit either through a cellular network, an internet network, radio networks, different kinds of networks. And how do you do that? And that's a whole story into itself. So the environmental conditions make it difficult to use some of the devices. And all this ruggedness, low cost, and also very easy to use. If you're going to have people like the Matses are going to be using these technologies, it needs to be, an interface needs to be good enough and easy enough for them to use over at least more than one person doing it. And that's hard to get that kind of market. That's hard to get developers to get that, to make things like that. There's not like an iPhone, there's billions of users, you can make the price go down, not maybe with an iPhone, but you know what I mean. If you have many users, price per unit can go down. If you have only a small market, like you technically do with the wildlife researchers, it's hard to recoup that R&D cost, and so it's harder to make things lower cost. So that's sort of they need low cost, and yet it's hard to do it because the market is small, so that's a bit tricky as well. The other thing I was going to say is personnel in the field. A lot of places, making sure people are trained, making sure people stay with the project. A lot of places you can train someone, the minute they get trained, they'll go to like a for-profit, higher paid job. So you just train them for that company, which is great. And also to make sure, something I think we'll probably get to, but is the action that all this technology can bring you all this information, but unless something happens.
What those would be in your experience.
Yeah, so I guess Claire mentioned I am a behavioral ecologist. So while we're talking about upscaling, the techniques that we use are amazing for being able to study these animals in remote areas, and they've provided incredible advances in the field of seabird research. But at some point, part of me does think, when I'm on a colony and looking at seabirds or at sea observing these animals, in their environment, you do see things that are harder to capture with some of the techniques that we have. And I do value the kind of ability to spend some amount of time with with seabirds that we're studying, because we do learn things that we wouldn't necessarily learn just through technology alone. So that's something that there's sort of a balance to some of the technology that we have. And then I guess as well from a wildlife biology standpoint, we're talking a lot about tracking. There has been a lot of research recently that some of the devices that we use do cause added stress. And this has been shown in seabirds that do diving. Having a backpack on your back with a tracking device does make it more difficult to forage underwater. So some of these techniques, while they're really advancing our field, we do have to consider the well-being of the animals that we're studying. And that's being done more and more. We're getting more and more information about how animals respond, through their stress hormones to some of the technology that we're kind of putting on them or imposing into their habitat. So yeah, there's definitely considerations to be made.
I would echo with what Sue was talking about, is that if you have camera traps or drones, and so you have a camera trap that catches individuals doing bushmeat hunting, commercial bushmeat hunting, or doing logging, what good is having that footage if there's no enforcement of that? If there's a legal system which is so difficult to come under that there's no enforcement, or sometimes it's the actual local people, the ones behind the chainsaw, or the ones doing doing the bushmeat hunting to feed their families and provide schooling for their children. So I think technology is a powerful tool. Okay? But it's not in of itself solutions, because it's not technology. So you have to basically address what are the true drivers of the deforestation and other factors within that. But the tools can be incredibly powerful. So with the map, with the map in hand, they lost a lot of their territory. The only reason that this area, the Amazon, is still intact, it still has primary forest, has mahogany, other trees, is because they fought. They fought and died to protect it against the rubber tappers and other outsiders that incurred upon their lands, and they lost a lot of their territories. And now, because they didn't have maps, they weren't able to know where their territories is. And even when their territories were given to them in their name, when they actually had no legal title to them, with these maps, they're fighting that, and they've already used these lands in discussions to rezone and to gain access to their ancestral territory. So it's really the technology itself can have these very powerful tools in terms of helping with their struggles.
So I mean, Chris, you mentioned drivers of deforestation. Actually, technology can be a driver of deforestation in the area where it works. Well, exactly where you work, but extracting gold in the Amazon and cobalt and places like that.
And I think it's using it's the bigger problem or the bigger issue that where an iPhone or many times a smartphone is the resource consumption in the developed world, the kind of the real cost and how we externalize the true cost of the lifestyles that we have, and where does that source from? So I think taking using a few iPhones to make to protect a large area of the Amazon is a good use of that technology. But I think we all have to ask ourselves in our daily lives is what is really driving the deforestation, the return, whether it's and that I think we can do a lot to model modify kind of the lives that we're living here. And because the effect, most of the initial effect is seen down in these areas, and the horrible mercury pollution and devastation of the rainforests in southern Peru is just one example of that.
So yeah, Sue, I mean, this issue, but also, I mean, maybe also data security. So I mean, if you're identifying where animals are and that's not a secure network, then aren't you essentially exposing these animals to poachers?
Yes, I suppose. I think some animals are not under threat from poaching, or not by people that are going to be looking into that. I think for the very high value animals that are, you know, sort of your elephant or your tiger for skin and bones, and rhino for their horn, for the most would be. I think there are people that are sophisticated enough that would be looking into other people's data. I actually have not worked with that before, but I have heard of it, and I know people also talk about, one thing I can say is they talk about people taking photos and uploading those to the internet and saying, oh, you're going to be telling the poachers where these animals are, where in fact, unless you're giving absolute coordinates that are accurate and a time at which the animal was there, poachers, at least with wildlife in a lot of places, do tend to know, like any poacher worth his or her salt, tends to know where the animals that they're looking for are in a general sense. They know they're in that protected area. They might not know exactly which part of the protected area today, and if you're giving them that information, that would be bad. But if you're not giving them the day, I mean, the animals move, you know, especially something like an elephant would move. It could have been there yesterday, but that doesn't mean he's anywhere near it today. So that's helpful. But in terms of people storing their data, I know that's a concern for a lot of researchers of how do you store your data securely, and I think that's also getting better in terms of cloud storage for, it's also a problem with sharing data. I think people are worried about sharing data on wildlife, at least that kind of thing, or, yeah.
Great, well, I don't want to monopolize questions. I'm sure there's questions from the audience, so I'll just ask one more for now. And that is, how can people in the room sort of help what you're trying to advance here?
Yeah, I guess I think I started out sort of giving a couple examples of projects I've been involved in. One of them was the New Zealand storm petrel, which I didn't mention was actually rediscovered by birders. So this is a species that was probably around in the open ocean, but until we had better kind of camera, digital cameras that birders were taking out, we didn't have the ability to identify what this like weird Wilson storm petrel was that actually was this extinct species. So I just want to tell that story to highlight the usefulness of people, engaging with their environment. And there's a lot of opportunities. Obviously I'm here with Seattle Audubon, so if you are a member or want to become one, we have so many different kind of community science opportunities that people can actually get involved in. And for the birding community especially, there's national databases online like eBird that's run out of Cornell, and these databases provide huge data sets for scientists to look at changes in biodiversity over time that can be linked to things like climate change and different kind of anthropogenic conservation concerns. So definitely try to get involved, and don't underestimate how valuable your being willing to just engage with your natural world really can be my advice.
It's all too it's all too easy kind of sitting in Seattle on a Thursday on 7 o'clock in the evening to kind of think, how can I make a difference, right? And a lot of times when we're looking through reporting in the news about often the news is pretty depressing, right? But it's not a case that we are failing because we're doing everything we can, applying every resource that we're not succeeding yet because there's so much we can do. And I would say that you can have an extraordinary difference. You find something that you're passionate about, whether it's helping out with funding, whether it's helping out with as a volunteer, or in any capacity, you can make an extraordinary difference. So I would echo with what Megan said, don't underestimate really the impact that you can have.
Yeah, I'd echo both of those things. I was going to give a volunteer example, which I think is kind of fun. There's some people that we covered on Wildtech It's an organization that is using camera trap images of poachers or intruders into a couple of different reserves where they work. And one reserve is in Hawaii, and they're looking at poaching trees, basically, and that kind of thing. And the others are in South Africa. And poachers tend to work at night because it's easier to get away with what you're doing. However, it's hard for guards and rangers to be active all day and all night, so they just sleep, at times. So what this group is doing is having a series of volunteers who have an app, and they can look at images that are coming from cameras. So the cameras are communicating with an app. And they can see anytime. The volunteers are there, and they can look at these images. They basically volunteer for a certain amount of time to go through images, and if they see anything, which is in real time, so the images are in real time. It might be 2 in the morning in South Africa, but it's perfectly nice, daytime work time in Colorado, which is where they're working more. Most of the volunteers are. So the volunteers will volunteer, and they see something. They will communicate with the organization, who then calls the people in South Africa and says, "There's somebody on camera 12 right now," and they can actually go without having to be looking at camera 12 all night, because they have volunteers that are during the day and they're wide awake looking at them. So that's just a simple example of. The tech is very high in terms of getting the camera traps to communicate with the app, and the app is just being used. But it's just a simple app, and people can easily use it. But they're just doing it on their own time, and they're happy to do it. It's fun, they can, and it's not that much time. They can do it as they wish. So anyway, that was kind of an interesting volunteer. But there's all kinds of volunteer opportunities, I think. And also, I was going to say is to read. And to learn, and I don't know how many people maybe use eBird in this group, probably, or iNaturalist, and I don't know what that plant is that I go by every day on my way to work. I can upload a photo and learn about it, and suddenly it means more to me than it did before. So technologies that are uploading photos when you go on Safari, there are several of those, or iNaturalist is one that works very well in this country, but increasingly broad. You can read Mongabay. Or other sort of sites. There are several sites that can give you information about the natural world or about what's happening in environmental news, that kind of thing. So those would all, and share it with your children. Just moving everything out. So.
Great, so I think we'll take questions from the audience. We don't have a roving mic, so I guess be loud.
I'm an engineer, and engineers tend to solve problems that don't exist really well. So I worked with the lab at the University of Washington studying Magellanic penguins. I built some weighing scales that go into the field, and the penguins walk across, and we measure the weight trends across the season and across multiple seasons. And the only reason I knew about that program was by devoting so much time volunteering with them, and I went down for 5 months to deploy the scales and maintain them. But how does a group of engineers, how do they find out about these problems? I'm thinking about new devices to make. Do I, where do I read about these problems? Do I have to go spend another 6 months with another lab? Or I don't want to make up problems like the penguins need to get from A to B. How do we get them there? Or how do we learn about these problems?
I would say you can read my site as one of our goals. No, seriously, one of our goals. Which I think, one of the goals of Wildtech, and maybe we should be doing a better job in terms of reaching the engineering community, was in fact that it was to inform people that work in conservation and research in the field of what kinds of technologies are being developed and who and how people are using them. A second audience was actually engineers, and how can you get engineers to consider the needs of these ruggedness and low cost and ease of use, durability types of things when you're designing something, the kinds of things to design, and that's tricky, again, because I was saying that the market is small, it's not necessarily the most profitable. At the same time, I think a lot of engineers find it very cool, and I've been told that to get an engineer to do something, it has to be cool. It doesn't have to pay well, it has to be really, really cool. And there's a lot of cool things out there, like to help seabird acoustic devices that can listen to animals, seismic surveys to listen to the rumbles that elephants make that are infrasound and that are lower than we can actually hear, but they're actually communicating that way. Things that can measure our environment, I guess, would be one thing I would say. But we try to do that on Wildtech. I would say maybe the local university, if they have researchers that are doing things, would be another source of information for an engineer to look at the ecology or environmental school, let's say, or department.
There are also things like eco-hacks in the builder communities where some conservation groups will come together, or researchers, and they'll make engineers aware of it. So I don't know how you actually find out about those things here in Seattle, but in the San Francisco Bay Area, we have them periodically. I participated in a couple, and it's really interesting bringing together a bunch of really smart engineers, who are in the audience, and you have some conservationists talking about what their problems are. It's a good way to sort of avoid the building solutions in need of a problem issue that often arises. More questions?
So, as somebody that uses research collections at the Burke Museum, it's very helpful to have those collections for studying different things. You were talking, Megan, about what to do with data, because there's so much data, right? Has there been any discussion between organizations to kind of centralize the data in a digital natural history museum repository so that other scientists can have access to it?
So let's actually take two questions, because that was really good. So did you?
Yeah, mine was kind of off of his question a little bit, the previous one.
Okay, so let's take both. Yeah.
Okay. It's two parts, a little bit, but there's all this technology that's happening here, I feel like, and you mentioned it a little bit, but I'm curious your energy or time spent on, one, maintaining the technology in these remote areas, like once it's down there, how much education and how much time you spend educating the people in those villages or towns. And then kind of on the same plane is when you introduce this technology, how much time and effort is spent educating, and are they open to being educated about these technologies?
What's the two questions? Centralizing collections, and then time spent maintaining technology and capacity building.
Yeah, so this is a great question, and it is something that more and more, when we go to publish papers, for example, now, typically you have to have your data stored in a place that's accessible to everybody. That, whether or not that actually is someplace that, maybe somebody outside your field is gonna look is more questionable. But I think you mentioned the Burke Museum, and a lot of the work I've done with sensory ecology has been with museum collections as well. And one really cool resource is the Macaulay Library, which is based out of Cornell. They house acoustics, a library for acoustics, which is kind of a different way of thinking about housing specimens, or how we can collect wildlife samples. So there are things like this now coming around that are sort of either online or in-person places where we can allocate these huge amounts of data that people are collecting. And I think that the scientific community in general is a community of like, oh, I don't want somebody to take my data. We're kind of protective of stuff, and I think that's changing a little bit. I think that with people having to share more of data and making that available just to make sure you've analyzed it properly, I think that kind of feeling is starting to shift. That's my impression anyway. And for Lauren's question, I'll hand it over.
Well, I think in terms of the capacitation and the training and their interest in it, I can share a couple of quick anecdotes of it. With the mapping project, we had sent over one of the GPS units that we purchased in Lima in its box through the military flights to the military outpost. And one of us was going to go down to take the next flight to train her, but the flights got delayed because they got rained out and things like that. The Matzes team got impatient of waiting for us. They opened the box, read the instructions. They went down for 8 weeks to map the headwaters of the Upper Yava region. It's really how quickly they learned from, and how the enthusiasm and how quickly they learned how to go from not even plugging in the laptop before to using complex mapping. There's like a course in Cornell of this mapping software. It's incredibly complex. The functions are in English, so they have to memorize what the pictures were within it, and they're incredible to embrace the new embrace the new technology. I said earlier that there's no cell phone coverage in most of the Matses territory. In the last 2 years, there's cell phone coverage in the kind of the gateway to the territory, which is a military outpost. And one of the villages, the first one down, was about an hour by boat away. And when the high chief of the tribe was flying back to Iquitos and was talking to to Bill, who co-founded the organization with me, and he said that after he got off the plane, he said to Bill, "Oh, call Segundo," one of the Matses, the young Matses who works with our projects. "He's waiting for you in his tree." And Bill was like, "In his tree?" And apparently they figured out if they climb the tallest tree in this village, that's an hour down, then they get cell phone. It's really when they bring back the phones with the images of the frogs or the herd. One thing we also see is all the videos they take of their medicinal plant gardens. They're recording of the elders doing traditional chants, and it's really quite extraordinary. So it's putting the technology in the right hands.
Susie, you have anything to add on that?
Sure. Sometimes it doesn't work. But yeah, making technology that's easy to use, again, makes it more, obviously less training needed and much more longevity applied to that particular site. There are plenty of examples, I think, that the technology is brought down, and once you need a repair, we're done. Drones are a really good example of this. They do need some training. You need to learn how to land, you need to learn how to take off, and flying is almost easier. The landing is hard. If you land wrong, it crashes and then things might break. That's why it's important. And there's examples of drones sitting in closets that crashed once and that was it. I was thinking of something we covered was a film about an indigenous community that was using drones, and it made a lot of press in terms of this film. I then contacted them to just follow up on the film for my post, and found out that in fact they weren't really using it anymore. There wasn't enough follow-up in terms of the training. I think that's a big problem. Follow-up to the training, they were trained quickly, but it wasn't enough, it wasn't long enough, it wasn't coming back in a couple of weeks or maybe a couple of months to make sure that it was working and make sure people were okay with it, they understood it. And then there's the idea of getting spare batteries, parts, things like that. So there is a problem with that. And to go also collections, I wanted to, that answers. For the collections section, I know there's also genetic data collections and there's movement data collections, a lot of data collection. So something like MoveBank, which is a place that researchers can deposit their movement data that they get from tracking technologies, or different genetic banks that will hold DNA and codes and things like that can be used as references for future studies. So that's another possibility for that. Yeah.
Great. Are there more questions?
This is more for Chris. Years ago, decades ago, I'd spent some time with the Kofan Indians with Rhett Butler. Yeah. And so I was just curious. I was listening to you talking and just thinking. I was following his work and his efforts to try to help them save their land also. And I haven't read anything on the use of technology, with his work. But do you guys all interface? Is it something that it's not just your community that you're working with there, but are other communities in the Amazon? Because that's a hell of a large area.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's some questions.
Oh, yeah.
Is there another question?
Late last year, I volunteered with Save America's Forests in DC, and one of the things I was doing was I was reviewing a project put out by World Resources Institute and Johns Hopkins University. And so I'm reaffirming the concept that the indigenous natives are the best protectors of the land, and also that financing is one of the largest obstacles. So this project involved a transfer of technology, which included GPS phones and a satellite phone. That's how they got away from the lack of coverage problem. 56 communities along the Napo and the Amazon River could have been protected for like $700,000. And as a matter of fact, in Peru, all of the laws and regulations are in place. And what has been lacking actually is timely information, so that the authorities can take the corresponding actions that they are authorized to do. And so this transfer of technology is about having indigenous people go out and take photographs of recently deforested areas, upload them onto the Global Forest Watch website, which has also wind and fire information. And so I'm sharing this because it's the idea of being able to immediately provide information to the authorities, sort of outsource to different people, whether it's herpetologists or people who study amphibians. And the question is, well, what species is it? Who can help identify? How can we get volunteers on board to check this out? This hasn't been funded yet. It's been partially funded. So the idea here is that there is a way to overcome cell phone coverage, but I haven't heard people talking about maps in terms of tracking animals or identifying a study habitat. Maps are very useful. So have you heard of Global Forest Watch and the maps?
Okay, so I think we'll take it broader, so collaboration both for you, Chris, but I think also generally about collaboration with other parties, and then also the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me start by answering that question. Yeah, I mean, our work builds on really extraordinary work done with other indigenous groups. There's been really amazing work with indigenous mapping, and each one is kind of adapted to its own particular area and such like that. And we're trying to take, with many of our projects, that next step. And so with the work with encyclopedia and the work with the map, but it's in there with the COFONs is their region, what the threats that they face is pretty staggering. And I think the technology is as the panel here has talked, is really a powerful tool. Collaboration is absolutely key with it. I mean, we work very closely with local organizations as well as with the local and then national ministries, because I think we can do things better, stronger together within that. We're still by most scale considered smaller based on our budget and such like that, but we try to do high impact work. So I'm familiar with the work, but we haven't directly collaborated with that project. But yeah, no, it'd be great to get satellite phones, but just not yet there in our budgets yet. But
So maybe talk about collaboration, and I don't know if you use global fishing lines or anything like that.
Yeah, to speak to collaborations, of course, so critical. And I think that that's not just the case across science. I mean, we're talking about technology today, and for most scientists, it's very difficult to be an expert in all of these different new techniques that are becoming available and becoming more widely used. So, I collaborate with people that do really high-tech tracking data analysis, and we are able to then make a better story of what is actually happening, piece these things together. That's a bit more obvious. I think that, we also have to collaborate with people that you wouldn't necessarily think about, and I collaborate quite a lot with fisheries people, people that work on the water, that are seeing these birds in their actual natural environment. That is the marine environment. So that's extremely important. And then of course, Chris has talked a lot about working with people, but from my perspective, I primarily work on islands that are governed by indigenous groups. So being able to learn from their traditional knowledge of the birds that nest in those places and the fish that are in the sea, surrounding the land, and how they use that has been not only valuable for me, but I think also we've been able to make collaborations with their youth and educating them a bit more about what we're learning about these species that are really theirs, that are really on their land, and that they use in traditional ways still. So collaborations are extremely important, and maps, yes, I don't have too much more to say about maps, but yes, we use maps a lot for a lot of things.
So, I can speak to Global Forest Watch. I think Global Forest Watch is one of the most important developments in the last 40 years for forest conservation. Mongabay uses Global Forest Watch quite extensively, and in fact, the origin of our network of journalists, where we now have 250 journalists in 50 countries, was from a Global Forest Watch project. So in 2014, after Global Forest Watch launched, I went to ground truth, a deforestation alert in North Sumatra. And so I went there. I started, when I had pajamas in my apartment. I went to Sumatra. I went with the local NGO, and we kind of just followed Google Maps. And we found this road that was illegal, wasn't on the map, and we drove as far as we could, and then we started walking. We came over a crest, and this large area of forest had been completely destroyed in the previous 3 months for oil palm. And so that all started, again, me in my pajamas in my apartment, typing stuff into my computer. We went and we interviewed the workers there, and they said, yeah, we chase elephants off every night with flaming torches. There were remnant orangutan nests and remaining trees, so very high biodiversity. And so the follow-up is that the NGO filed a lawsuit against the company, and then some of the international activist groups like Rainforest Action Network started campaigns against PepsiCo and some of the companies that were sourcing from this plantation. So it was pretty, and then I decided, well, let's scale this globally and see what we can do. And so taking this data, and so Global Forest Watch is interesting because it is a collaboration. So there's like 70 or 80 institutions, like Johns Hopkins, I guess, is one of them. So it is really exciting. It's an open platform. Both satellite data from NASA, but also Planet and other platforms, and then also bottom up as well. So you have indigenous people who are feeding that data into the system. So I would be curious, though. I mean, Chris, do the Matses use Global Forest Watch at all? Okay, I mean, you're pretty bandwidth constrained.
Yeah, no, it's a very, the percentage of Matses that have computer literacy, I mean, most of the Matses are still monolingual, they speak their own language, and so it's mainly the younger generation that speaks Spanish and that have access to that. I mean, I would say that, when you said about finding information and improving, the amount of enforcement in these most remote areas is marginal at best, and so the Matses take it upon themselves to enforce their own territories. And their way they have their villages strategically is all the access points into their territory. Because, in these local areas, whether it's collecting turtle eggs or it's bushmeat hunting or selected timber, most of it goes unreported. It happens all the time. Every time I'm down there in the frontier, you see evidence of it, and then the amount of actual enforcement that goes. And in so many areas, it's actually the local inhabitants, that are doing just to make to develop a livelihood. And it's obviously it's short-sighted, but there's not much alternatives for it, and that's a very tragic reality of it.
Yeah, and just, for people who don't know Global Forest Watch is, essentially it aggregates data from all different sources, so satellite data, but then also plantation data, and puts it on a map. And so you can look at different layers. If you want to see the oil palm plantations in Indonesia, you can see that layer. You can see how much deforestation is happening within those concessions. So there's a lot of value there. And Mongabay, again, does a lot of reporting around that data, and a lot of other institutions are using it as well. And so what it's done is essentially it's created a system where we can now see where forest cover loss is happening. So we no longer have the ignorance as an excuse. So the question is there the political will and resources to actually take action? So in the Brazilian Amazon, there's this huge reduction in deforestation between 2004 and 2012, about 80% reduction, which is, in terms of climate impact, that's greater than removing all the cars from US roads. A lot of carbon was saved by that reduction in deforestation. Well, most of that reduction in deforestation was a product of a near real-time monitoring system, which we now have globally thanks to Global Forest Watch. So it's very significant, but you have to have the political will to take action and the capacity. So, where Chris is working, it's up to the indigenous people. They're the last stand for this. I don't know how we are
for Global Forest Watch. Just that it's updated very, very frequently, like every week, basically, in terms of how often data are coming in. The other thing that they do, I will say, that's relatively new and only available in certain countries right now, is the alerts. So if there's a change in forest cover, pixel by pixel, like these sort of 30 by 30 meter, if something happens, and it happens repeatedly, you can register. Any of you could sign up for, I want to receive an alert for my area of the world, or an area that I'm interested in, whether it's a national park or just a general area that I'm interested in, a property that I know about or own or something like that. You can look at the status of forest even if you're not there, and it's updated very, very frequently. And you can be sent an alert to your email if there's a repeated, high probability that something has happened. Maybe a tree just fell down, in which case it wasn't deforestation, but maybe it was deforestation. So it's something you could then look at, but you wouldn't have to be on the ground to look at it. You could receive this literally in your email. So
yeah, you can draw a polygon around whatever shape you want. Yeah. So just quickly, how are we doing for time? One more question? Okay, so how do we take 3 questions at once? All right.
You've mentioned a number of problems you've already identified. One is the energy problem with your batteries for cell phones. You've mentioned problems about too much data. Data's great, but you don't have enough means of analyzing it. You also mentioned the problem of people in Colorado looking at these real-time things. You can actually have an artificial intelligence look at and find the pieces where there's some action that can help you. So when you have an engineer, engineers have Engineers Without Borders that do a lot of projects overseas, a lot of times a bit naive because they start from an engineering standpoint, but you have a bigger group of people and you then start learning. One of the things, though, you didn't mention, and you've alluded to, is that as you get more information can be a very dangerous thing for both the scientists and the animals, as well as the indigenous people. Because if you see on your land that your forest is being destroyed and you try to stop that, you may be running up against very powerful businesses, governments, foreign governments. And so, as you are doing this, is there a way that you can fall back on organizations that will sort of support you or the people that you're dealing with? Because this could lead them into a rather dangerous situation. With loggers, with everything.
Okay, that's one question, so.
So my question was kind of directed at Megan. I was reading an article the other day and they were talking about using maybe like ultrasonic frequencies to deter bat collisions with wind turbines. I know with seabirds in particular, them being caught as bycatch is a really big conservation issue. And so I was kind of wondering if you could speak to, you said you work with some fisheries groups, ways that we can utilize resources more efficiently, because you're not going to be able to, shut down fisheries. You can decrease that, but I want to know about maybe innovative technologies that you guys are using to try to mitigate that environmental impact. And yeah, like I said, maybe extract resources in a more efficient manner.
Oh, there's one more question.
Yeah, so I think like AI has been really increasing in the past couple of years, but particularly in my opinion, I think part of it has to do with open sourcing of large frameworks for this AI. Like in 2015, Google released TensorFlow, and I feel like after that, you see a lot more software, not by large corporations, for like image recognition or natural language processing. But I was kind of wondering, is there an impact of open source software in ecology? And you guys discussed funding, and open source is by definition free. So I was just wondering if you kind of describe like how it's used,
Sure, okay, so we've got three questions. So one is how to mitigate risk to environmental defenders that may result from this technology. Another is to mitigate bycatch and make resource extraction more efficient. And the last one is what is the impact of open software on conservation and how is it used? So, go crazy.
I think, having the information, these are the realities and these on the ground are really complex, because you have, there's divisions between local communities and those who want to protect the logging, and then others that have no other economic opportunities. And in the end, like in the Motzes territories, there's actually only so much logging you can do because it's all pretty inaccessible. But timber companies are very interested in having extraction there, because they can use they can say that timber sourced from another more accessible region was actually that's above the source there. Timber companies are owned by narco traffic. The whole thing is really quite and it's very challenging. But I think having those, having the tools to be able to know and to monitor deforestation or poaching, other aspects can be, but there has to be the mechanisms in place where there can be enforcement of that. And with the truth about timber industry in these areas is when the Motzes get involved to it, they often don't get paid for it. It's absolutely backbreaking and dangerous work. They only can cut the trees near the small jungle rivers, because that's the only ones that can get out there. That devastates the ecosystems of the river they depend upon for fish. they often don't get paid for it, and then those hardwoods are sold and for the multifold higher scale cost within it, and they get very little for that. So it's very, very challenging to address these, and there's not one single solution to it. And technology is one tool that can help with that.
Okay. So for the environmental defenders, it is a big concern. So especially among major funders now, the past 2-3 years, it's been a major issue that people have been focused on. Global Witness has been doing a lot of documentation of threats to environmental defenders. The rates are really high of killings now. I don't know whether they're increasing because the data is getting better. So it's hard to say, but they're certainly very high risk in a lot of parts of the world. But things like cell phones are in some ways conferring some protection because communities can now communicate before they, when they could before. So in Indonesia, you might have an isolated community 20 years ago that would just be wiped out by a militia, but now they can actually communicate with other communities and sort of mobilize. So that's significant. There are also some interesting technologies where that confer some sort of protection. So if someone's documenting something, it's essentially locked in your phone. So if your phone got seized, there'd be no way to get that data out. So it's like a secure way to communicate. So I'll let you guys handle the last three.
Can I just add on to that as well?
Yeah.
Just thinking of like people, like whistleblowers and people that report stuff, reporting something illegal that you see. There are increasingly places that have secure uploads. I'm trying to think, WildLeaks, I think, is it WildLeaks? Yeah, like a WikiLeaks, but WildLeaks. If you see something illegal happening, being sold or being done, you can use these services, I guess you can call them, which are using technologies like the dark web or different kind of ways of encrypting uploads so that the uploader of say, a photo, are not exposed to a violent reaction, let's say, or brutality because of what you've done by a company, let's say, that you're reporting on. So there are those kinds of things. And also rangers is another thing I was going to say. Rangers are really having a lot of trouble in places that are protecting, again, high-value wildlife like a rhino, like an elephant, especially in Africa, are increasingly under threat by poachers who shoot first and don't actually even ask the questions later. They just go. So technology that can help them, for instance, see at night, like a thermal imaging that can help a ranger team see at night, will help against that kind of thing. That was just another thing I thought of in terms of.
Do you want to speak to open software?
I don't know a lot about open source software in terms of like how many people or what are the effects of open software. It's a good question. I don't know. I know it's more and more available. Open source software, more technology are being used. Both small scale and I think larger scale like TensorFlow, but also even smaller scale people who are making their data available and more freely available, and also their technologies more freely available. But I don't actually know the impacts of them, so I wish I could answer that question. I don't know. But it's a good question. It'd be something to investigate. It's very broad. It's being done in many small locations as well. So that's a tough one.
Yeah, I love your question about bycatch, and I think you mentioned how can we think innovatively about this problem, and that's one of my favorite things to think about for seabird conservation is things like bycatch. These are issues that we've known about for years, and yet we still have them. It's still a major threat for seabirds. I was really lucky to get a contract actually to do some investigations into fisheries bycatch and how it impacted seabirds, and was given a lot of free rein. And so I got to use the things that I'm really interested in, which is how seabirds sense the world around them to try to answer that question. And so you kind of mentioned ultrasound or ultrasonic deterrence for fisheries bycatch, and that's not something that we looked at, but ultrasonic, the use of that for seabirds is sort of something that people are only kind of talking about. So it's a great idea. But yeah, I think that we need to think more creatively around science issues in general. And the thought that science is very much a STEM field is true, but we also have to be creative. And I was able to look at things like how birds actually see underwater. How does their visual kind of acuity underwater make it so that they can see baits? And how can we make it so they can't see baits? So things like that are really interesting, and I think we have to think creatively about problems that have been ongoing for years and that remain major issues. So it's a great question. I don't know if I answered it, but I liked it. Thank you.
Great, we want to thank the panel.
Yeah, just another round of applause for Rhett, Megan, Chris, and Sue. We really appreciate the local perspective as well as the international perspective on how we can all continue to follow these activities and learn more on mongabay.com. Thanks, everybody.